Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. Also, don't forget to check out my Substack. So today's episode is a part of a sister episode with tomorrow's episode about the impact of the steppe on history. And of course, it was reflections on the historical importance of the steppe that led Mackinder to develop the Heartland theory. And we'll talk about the Heartland theory tomorrow. So let's start. There's a general downplaying of the importance of the steppe nomads in Western academic scholarship. For example, on the political right, we have Victor Davis Hanson, who is famous for his Carnage and Culture, sought to demonstrate that the current level of Western military superiority enjoyed from Columbus to the War on Terror was the result of an unbroken line of cultural superiority from ancient Greece till the present day. This theory, of course, totally falls apart if you include the steppe nomads on this question. The Scythian nomads shattered once mighty Assyrian Empire. The Scythian army, led by Queen Tamaris, slew Cyrus the Great, and Darius was checked in his expansion into the western steppe. Spidamides destroyed one of Alexander's flying columns in 328 BC at Samarkand, the worst Macedonian defeat ever up to that point. Parthia represented a semi-nomadic Persian dynasty who utilized the same style of warfare of the steppe and scored victories against the Seleucids and the Romans, famously at Kara in 53 BC, Mark Antony's expedition in 36 BC, victories over Caracalla and Emperor Macrinus at Nibissus in 217 AD. The Huns under Attila ravaged the Eastern and Western Roman empires. His defeat at Chalons in 451 did not prevent him from invading Italy the next year, where he was most likely bought off by the Pope. And also there was rumors that the Eastern Roman Empire would send troops as well to check his advance into Italy. Numerous lesser-known tribes, such as the Avars, Khazars, Magars, Pechenegs, Kichpiks, and Cumans, all dominated Western armies. The few victories, such as under Charlemagne or at Lechfeld in 955 AD, were the result of Western armies adapting mounted warfare tactics themselves and striking the nomads where they were vulnerable, as at Lechfeld, being laden with gold, or were led by a military genius such as Charlemagne. And it must be remembered as well that the Magyars in their raids did penetrate as far as Italy and France, recapitulating, though on a smaller scale, the major raids of Attila. The Russian state suffered numerous setbacks against nomadic forces, with Moscow being sacked as late as 1571 AD by the Tartars. The Mongols, of course, destroyed European armies in many pitched battles. The Rus-Kuman force at the Kalka River in 1223 AD, a combined Polish Templar army at Legnica in 241 AD, and the Hungarian army was destroyed the same year at Mohai. The attack on Poland was a diversionary measure to prevent other European forces from coming to Hungary's aid. So if you ignore all of this and more, it looks like the Western armies never lose. So there's a serious amount of padding that not just Victor Davis Hanson, but generally right-wing military scholarship in the West has, where if you just ignore all that, which, again, the actual classical medieval sources would never have been so glib or cavalier. They knew very well the weaknesses that they had vis-a-vis these forces. Now, on the left, it goes a similar way. So we have David Graeber's debt the first 5,000 years. The theory goes like this: hunter-gatherers and pastoralists were mostly peaceful, mostly egalitarian, and overall the pinnacle of humanity. With the advent of agriculture, we get cities, class hierarchy, standing armies, and money. The fall from Eden. This is really a rather silly idea. Who had more class hierarchies, the Mongols or the Chinese? Who was more violent and ruthless, the Mongols or the Chinese? This is a joke. Needless to say, Graeber spends little to no time on the steppe and its warriors. Furthermore, David Graeber also makes a point that one point which is correct, but another point which is not, that the rise of coinage specifically was used to pay soldiers. And we know the first coins were an alloy of, I think it was gold and silver called Electra, minted in Lydia. And yeah, that does help pay soldiers rather than paying them in kind. But the idea that militarism and conquest wouldn't otherwise happen without money is ridiculous. For example, Sparta didn't have money. They had iron bars, which were notoriously unwieldy on purpose. And the nomadic horse lords only needed money really to trade with settled societies. And they were just as expansionist and warlike as the Assyrians or the Persians or the Greeks. So there's this weird fetish on like the left with a kind of, because right, these societies that have little to no class hierarchy or structure, it's not a philosophical commitment to egalitarianism. In the case of the steppe, it's the result of environmental conditions. You just can't build cities and you can't do agriculture, so you don't have large stratified class societies. This isn't how it works, given the level of technology at the time. And so both of these groups have a vested interest in underplaying or downplaying the influence of the steppe forces on world history, even though if we go back to Mackinder, the father of geopolitics, it's the central importance that region plays, which is the centerpiece of his theory on geopolitics. So I feel like it's important to underline and underscore why these are so important. And of course, why this gives birth to geopolitics in the first place, because of this central importance to history. So let's begin briefly with the discussion of the steppe itself and the nomads who live there. The steppe is a vast region of grassland that stretches from Ukraine in the west to Manchuria in the east. The steppe is divided by the Altai Mountains in western Mongolia into the western steppe and the eastern steppe. From about 1500 BC to 1644 AD, we see nearly 3,000-year hegemony of the steppe warrior, from the conquest of the Indus Valley civilization by the Indo-Aryans to the Manchu conquest of the Ming Dynasty from chariot riders to horseback riders. We see the military dominance of the nomads over sedentary forces. Two key tools were the backbone of the steppe warrior, the horse and the bow. First with chariots and then riding on single horses, the nomadic rider was able to cover great distances at speed, often surprising a sedentary foe before he knew everything was amiss. The composite bow, made of wood, sinew, and animal bone, formed the weapon of choice for these warriors, allowing the shooter to disrupt enemy formations at a distance. This connection with maneuverability and firepower were unmatched. The last element to be added were the armored lancers, which originated with the Parthian cataphracts. Shock was added to the ensemble. With mobile fire and shock units, the nomad forces would disrupt enemy formations with arrow fire and then run them down with lancers. A classic example of this would be the defeat of Crassus at Kara. This mode of combat was only checked by fortresses and scorched earth tactics. Some nomadic confederations were able to acquire engineers, such as Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan, and reduce fortified settlements. So, for example, as they plundered and looted and extorted money, they could then hire engineers. And if they were savvy enough, like Attila or Genghis Khan, they would, which means they could conquer more cities and get more plunder and loot. Sometimes sedentary powers defeated invading steppe armies, but never or not for long did they conquer the steppe homeland. The only major exception to the steppe homeland being occupied would be under certain parts of the Tang dynasty. They occupied parts of the eastern steppe using more or less very similar nomadic tactics. The main limiting factor was access to horses, which they called the heavenly horses from the Fergana Valley, which I think is in today modern Turkmenistan. And access to those, if they had it, could allow them to project power into the eastern steppe. And once they lost it, they lost control of the eastern steppe. And the western steppe was never subjugated until the Russians. So it's this combination and so if we think about what this allows them to do, it allows them to have great flexibility. It allows them to be adaptable. The other thing is that, like Western armies, nomadic forces were very much interested in meritocracy and individual initiative. So, for example, if you read The Secret History of the Mongols, you'll read that Genghis Khan would delegate power and authority to his generals to make decisions on the spot. Whereas there wouldn't be this long chain of command, there wouldn't be this bureaucratic BS that got in the way of making decisions. And so, much like the Greeks or the Romans or later Western armies, the nomadic forces rewarded initiative, quick thinking, and independent action, which gave them an advantage both over their eastern enemies, the Chinese and the Persians, as well as Western armies. The only way you could really effectively stop them was with fortresses and scorched earth. The problem being, of course, scorched earth weakens your own state by destroying crops and farmland. So, they want to loot and pillage you, and of course, your best defense is to loot and pillage before they do. It's kind of not a great situation. And if they were determined enough, they could take a city by hiring engineers, like Attila or Genghis Khan could. You could also train in the nomadic fashion. The Mamelukes did this and defeated the Mongols at the Wells of Goliath. They also had the Tong do this to defeat some of the Turkic tribes, and the Russians would eventually do this before they converted primarily to gunpowder. But what is the effect that the nomads had on the steppe? Well, a good expression of nomadic psychology is from Dmitry Merzhevsky, is quoted from Lothrop Stoddard's The Revolt Against Civilization, The Rise of the Underman. Dmitry Merezovsky thus admits the innate wildness of the Russian soul. We fancy that Russia was a house. No, it is merely a tent. The nomad set up his tent for a brief period, then struck it, and is off again in the steppes. The naked level steppes are the home of the wandering Scythian. Wherever in the steppe a black point appears and grows larger in the vision, the Scythian horde sweeps down upon it and levels it to the earth. They bump and ravage until they leave the wilderness to resume its sway. The craving for unbroken distances, for a dead level, for naked nature, for physical evenness and metaphysical uniformity, the most ancestral impulse of the Scythian mind, manifests itself equally in Arkachev, Bakunin, Pugachev, Razin, Lenin, and Tolstoy. This is an apt description of the nomadic mentality and the threat they pose to civilized nations. The broad historical impact of the steppe and its peoples is that of a civilizational reset. They're sort of like the mods that, make sure that no civilization gets too strong and breaks the game. They just swoop in and destroy it. Periodically, as sedentary nations in China, India, Persia, Western Asia, or Europe developed, the accumulated wealth would entice nomadic raiders to sweep down out of the steppe to destroy them. The inherent political division of a tribal confederation could only be overcome by a charismatic leader, a great Khan, and the promise of loot and plunder, a sufficiently rich target. For example, China was repeatedly invaded, raided, and pillaged by Huns, Turks, and later Mongols. Such invasions put a constant downward pressure on China, hobbling its development. Now, we all know about the Mongol invasions of China and how brutal that was. But also in the 8th century, the Tang dynasty was destabilized by the An Lushan rebellion, where a Chinese Turkic general who was on the frontier allied with the Turkish Uyghurs and intervened in China and overthrew the empire to proclaim himself king. And even though he was defeated, something like 15 million Chinese died in the process. And this is just what happens. This is just the cycle that they were stuck in as long as the steppe remained in this anarchic state. Such invasions put a constant downward pressure on China, hobbling its development. Similar incursions afflicted India and Persia. Europe, from the time of Attila down to the defeat of the Golden Horde in 1480 at Urga River, could be greatly discomforted by the nomads of the steppe. Vast sums of money were sent to Attila, no doubt helped weakening the Western Roman Empire. So there are two major important questions that can be answered by appealing to the effect of the steppe nomads. So in scientific terms, we can talk about an event that has multiple causal factors, but we can talk about a driving factor, which is the main factor that drives the entire process, even if it's affected by other things. And I think that the best way to understand the nomadic force is that they are a driving factor in a lot of Eurasian development until the 15th, 16th centuries. And the two questions are, why did the West supersede the East in the 15th century? And why didn't industrial civilization develop earlier than the 19th century? For much of its history, the Chinese state was more technologically advanced than Western Europe, and even for that matter, the Near East. In the 15th century, we have the Great Divergence, where Western Europe, in the form of the empires of Spain, Portugal, France, and England, initiate the age of exploration and catapulted ahead of the great empires of Asia. In order to develop a commercial thalassocracy, and by extension an industrial society on top of that foundation, a society must have a certain level of accumulated wealth and knowledge. The society must be wealthy enough to support a percentage of the population in purely mercantile, academic, and speculative or non-practical work. Prior to the advent of gunpowder, the military supremacy of the steppe ensured that this threshold was not met. The nomads routinely flew down upon Eurasian empires and states, destroying them. This downward pressure from the steppe prevented any civilization from developing enough wealth and accumulated knowledge to break out into a financial and then technological society. While bureaucratic states produced more regular and reliable results, the advantages of such organization was not enough to compete with steppe military prowess. Gunpowder changed all that. and also allowed settled societies, specifically Russia, to push back. From the year 1000 to 1492, Western Europe, France, Italy, Germany, the Low Countries, and England were all protected from nomadic incursion by the extension of Western civilization eastward. Unlike China or India, Western Europe could appeal to a transnational force, the Catholic and Orthodox churches, to bring in otherwise barbarian forces without the use of force. With the conversion of the Norse and Hungarians to Catholicism, this core could develop unmolested until the age of Columbus. In the same time, Persia is invaded by the Seljuks and the Mongols. China is ruled by the Mongols for 150 years under the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols destroyed Baghdad, ending the Islamic Golden Age, and otherwise trashed Eurasia, the Near East, and Russia and India are destroyed by the raids of Tamerlane. So what's important here is that while certainly Islam could in theory have served a similar purpose, and in fact the Turks were converted to Islam, the Seljuks were pretty ruthless. They also greatly upset, though not destroyed, the Islamic situation in the 11th century. Even with the Ming resurgence in the 14th century, raids from nomads still harmed Chinese power. As far as we saw in the period from 476 and to 1000, when Western Europe was under pressure from the Norse, steppe nomads, and Saracens, serious development was difficult to impossible. I mean, we had Charlemagne in his brief Carolingian Renaissance, but once he died and his kingdom was divided amongst the sons, that more or less was put on hold for the indefinite future. This condition remained for much of Eurasia. If the Mongol armies of Sabodai had not been recalled due to the death of the Great Khan, and those armies redirected towards richer targets in China and Persia, one is tempted to imagine a stillborn Renaissance with Milan, Pisa, Florence, Genoa, and Rome burned to the ground by Mongol horsemen, forever altering the course of history. If northern Italy had suffered the fate of Baghdad, it is not inconceivable that Western hegemony is stillborn. Western economic and scientific development can largely be credited to pushing back of the nomads so that the core of the civilization was not under threat, something that China, Iran, and India failed to achieve. Russia is, of course, a separate case in that they were occupied by the Golden Horde for 200 years and still managed to push back. We'll get to Russia in a moment. As long as the nomadic threat remained unchecked, I argue that they made it impossible for any state to accumulate enough wealth to have an industrial revolution. In this regard, we can thank the state of Muscovy for being a bulwark against the horde and from giving rise to European hegemony. This opinion is echoed by Gibbon. We can quote from chapter 38 of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Such formidable emigrations can no longer issue from the north, and the long repose which has been imputed to the decrease of population is the happy consequence of the progress of arts and agriculture. Instead of some rude villages thinly scattered among its woods and morass, Germany now produces a list of 2,300 walled towns. The Christian kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Poland have been successively established, and the Hanseatic merchants with the Teutonic Knights have extended their colonies along the coast of the Baltic, as far as the coast of Finland. From the Gulf of Finland to the Eastern Ocean, Russia now assumes the form of a powerful and civilized empire. The plow, the loom, and the forge are introduced on the banks of the Volga, the Oby, and the Lena. And the fiercest of the Tartar hordes have been taught to tremble and obey. The reign of the independent barbarism is now contracted to a narrow span, and the remnant of the Kalmucks or Uzbeks, whose forces may be almost numbered, cannot seriously excite the apprehensions of the great Republic of Europe. So, Gibbon's writing in the first Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire was published in 1776, when America was declared independent. So he was writing when this was still within memory that, yeah, these guys could swoop in and just destroy things. We're so far removed from that, we don't have that same perspective. And so, to recap this particular point, the accumulation of wealth necessary for a scientific or technical or industrial society was not met, because as soon as a certain level was met, it then kicked in the nomadic warlord phase where a great Khan would rise up and then smash that civilization, take all of its wealth, and start over again. Western Europe was special in that as it pushed the frontiers further east, it was protected from this, unlike other Eurasian states, and therefore had a long-term competitive advantage, which I think is one of the things that, when you look at some of the explanations, well, why didn't this happen earlier? Well, I mean, one of them might be, well, the Roman Empire had slavery, so they didn't have machines because they had slaves. Or you might say, well, the new atheist Chud take, it was because of Christianity. Or you might say, well, China didn't do it because they were an autocracy. Well, all of these have problems because the commercial revolution was under a slave society, Spain and Portugal, especially on the global stage. And then the Confederacy used the cotton gin. So a slave society was more than willing to adopt the technical improvements of modern technology. Russia was an autocratic society, which didn't respect property rights or the rights of individuals, according to Richard Pipes. So in that regard, they're much more like China than the West, and yet they were able to also develop technology and push the step back. So, as well as the fact that all these other Eurasian states were constantly being pillaged. I mean, even as late as the 18th century, the Uzbeks threatened the independence of Persia. In the early 18th century, Russia, the Uzbeks, and the Turks were invading Persia and almost wiped it out until a great leader, Nadir Shah, rose to power and drove them all back. So this was a threat that in certain parts of Asia lasted for a very long time. And of course, gunpowder is necessary but not sufficient. I mean, we know China had gunpowder. We know Persia had gunpowder. That wasn't quite enough to defeat the hordes, especially with the Manchus defeating the Ming. But it was essential for the Russians to expand eastward across Siberia and the steppe. So it's certainly of vital importance that actually happens, though you need to have other factors involved as well. Russia is unique in that, like Eastern empires of China, Persia, and India, it was an autocratic regime which lacked the respect for individual rights and liberties, and especially the right of property, and yet did adapt to the latest Western military engineering technology. We might also say that the three gunpowder empires of Islam, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, in the 16th century did as well, though unlike Russia, they eventually fell behind in the adoption of Western military technique. This gave the Russians a supreme advantage over the nomads of the steppe, as well as the Turks, Persians, and Chinese. Russia represented a bureaucratic state which produced reliable and predictable results over time. This contrasted with the tribal confederations of the nomads of the steppe, which led to weak political organization unless united by a great Khan. A great Khan could and did limit Russian eastward expansion. In 1380, the state of Muscovy in the Battle of Kulikovo decisively defeated the Golden Horde, and it looked like the Tartar yoke was finally over. Yet Toktamish crushed the Muscovite state in the siege of Moscow in 1382, ensuring another 100 years of Tartar yoke. Later wars with Tamerlane ensured that the Golden Horde would eventually fall into disrepair and break up. After the decisive battle of the Terek River in 1395. The Golden Horde survived because no other neighboring threat after Tamerlane was strong enough to depose it. We see that under a competent leader of a unified tribal confederation, the nomads could hold Russia down. Their own downfall was infighting, as we saw with Toktamish and Tamerlane. Finally, in 1480, at the Battle of the Ugra River, the Tartar yoke is finally overthrown and Muscovy is an independent state. In both battles at Kulikovo and Ugra River, the Muscovites fought in a manner similar to the Mongols with mounted lancers and mounted archers. The Mamelukes as well copied Mongol tactics to beat the Mongols. With a major state established in northwestern Russia, the state of Muscovy utilized its organizational and tax base to build a professional army with the latest Western weapons such as muskets, cannons, and modern fortress methods. And under Ivan IV, Kazan was taken, opening up eastward expansion. By 1639, the Russians had reached the Pacific with the founding of Okhotsk. From 1480 to 1639, the entry of the steppe was subjected to Russian rule. In a sense, this was a numbers game. In the long run, with the aid of gunpowder, Russia would win out in the end. The nomads could not stamp out the Russian identity. And this is, of course, where Eastern Orthodoxy comes in. While there had been nomadic Indo-Aryan Scythian tribal leaders, right down to the Cumans in the time of the Mongol invasion, and even before that, Slavic tribes and the Norse tribes, there was no organizing principle. Because even before there was a Russian Muscovite state, the organizing principle was the Orthodox faith. And that really kept Russia together under the Golden Horde, even after almost all political institutions were destroyed. And that's something the Mongols could not or chose not to uproot. And then, of course, with the union of that with the centralized state under Muscovy, they were then able to effectively push back against the nomads. The unconquerable steppe was conquered by saltpeter. While a great Khan could overcome a gunpowder civilization, as we saw in the Manchu conquest of the Ming dynasty, such favorable conditions did not exist in the wake of Tamerlane's depredations. Siberia and the steppe were subjected by a combination of long deployments of professional soldiers using muskets and artillery, fighting in the counter tactic of the wagon fort, and the Russians the Gulag Gorod, backed with a professional logistics train and with the aid of the Don Cossacks, who fought themselves like nomads. One by one, the Khanates fell. This is a world historical event on par with the Spanish discovery and conquest of the New World, but which in the context of Anglo historiography is treated with little attention. In many ways, especially after 1480, Russia can be credited with holding back the horde to allow Europe time to develop. Not that this was intentional, but that's the necessary consequence. Just like Byzantium holding off Islam bought Europe time. They weren't trying to buy Western Europe time, they were trying to defend themselves, but nonetheless, that's the effect that it had. So in many ways, you could argue that throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it was the Eastern Orthodox nations that were holding back the tide of both Saracen and Islamic and nomadic forces, which gave Western Europe time to develop. And I guess Western Europe paid them back with the Fourth Crusade. So, try to figure that one out. Let's see. Throughout a combination of better organization, better economic base, increased professionalism, and new technology, the proud nomads of the steppe fell never to rise again. This closing of the steppe inspired Mackinder in his 1904 The Geographical Pivot of History essay to speculate about the steppe's importance in modern political and industrial times, generating the Heartland theory. And the reason why I chose the title, The Ending of the Columbian Epoch, is that that's the terminology that Mackinder uses. When you fight against, quote, non-political agents and these pacification techniques, you can have long-going military conflicts that don't have global or political implications. So when the Russians are putting down Siberian rebellions, that's not going to upset anybody in, say, Great Britain. Whereas if they try to take Constantinople, that might, or recover Constantinople, that might lead to the Crimean War where Britain backs up Turkey. And so the closing of the steppe by the Russians is the end of this pre-political order. And now we have a political order where we have territorial boundaries that other nation states recognize. And now a conflict there does have the chance to become a concern of the whole world rather than just some local issue. So to briefly summarize these points, imagine both conservative and liberal academics have reasons to ignore the nomads of the steppe, both for the same reasons, their aggressive and militarily dominant historical position. The conservative does so because he doesn't want the Western military reputation to look sullied, even though, again, at the time, Greeks and Romans and medieval authors were like, wow, these guys are terrible. They're going to just swoop down and, destroy us. And the liberals, or progressive historians, because they believe in, equality, egalitarianism, don't want to believe that hunter-gatherers can actually be some of the most vicious and expansionist forces out there. So there's that. The nomads of the steppe combined mobility, firepower, and shock into a deadly fist that smashed empires from France to China. They were unconquerable on their own home territory and very difficult to stop in their invasions. Only being stopped if you could copy them like the Mamelukes, build fortresses, or use scorched earth. The fact that its commercial and industrial revolutions did not take place sooner in Eurasian history is largely responsible to the threat of the nomads. So the nomads are the driving factor holding down Eurasian socio-political economic development. A certain level of wealth is needed for a society to have merchants and academics operate with their minds rather than their hands before an accumulation of wealth and knowledge can give rise to these changes. So such a threshold was out of reach as long as the horde could sweep in and smash everything. With the use of Christianity as a transnational organization, Western Europe kept pushing the frontiers eastward by bringing the Norse, Hungarians, and Poles into a Western commonwealth of faith, with Byzantium bringing Russia into the Orthodox faith. This created a buffer for development that neither Russia, China, Persia, or India had. This breathing space was crucial for the Renaissance and Western dominance. Imagine Italy ravaged by the Mongols. Gunpowder finally gave settled peoples a means to fight back and conquer the steppe. Russia merged both Western and Asiatic modes of life, conquered the steppe, and achieved something of world historical importance on par with the Spanish discovery and conquest of the New World, which is, of course, where Mackinder picks up, and this is where the beginning of geopolitics as a concrete set of philosophical and political concepts develops. So, let's see here. We have a super chat from Double Time for $2. Thanks for the great stream. Well, thank you for the support. So what kind of got me thinking about this was, for many years, going back to Age of Empires, one of my favorite units was the horse archer, and of course then it went into, and then of course there's the whole history of the nomads behind that, and their invincible reputation or near invincible. And then the question is, well, what was their overall effect in practice? Or we could go into the minutia of all the campaigns and Western and Chinese and Persian sources, but I think the overall explanation is that they were this chaotic force that held down development. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's what happened. And what that means in the long run is that until this changes, you're not going to get to the Renaissance, the Age of Reason, the Industrial Revolution. And in this regard, gunpowder is an invention on par with fire. It literally just completely changes the game. And the nation that uses it most effectively to subjugate the steppe are the Russians. And when the Russians close the steppe, that also benefits China, because after 1639, well, actually, no, it doesn't really, because they get conquered by the Manchus. But the point is, though, future attacks are no longer going to come from that direction. It's just that right before Russia closed it off, the one last great attack of nomads hit China. And then it was, took out the Ming Dynasty. And so I think one of the reasons when people talk about the Great Divergence, why China didn't develop a modern society, but Europe did, is much of the discourse, I think, is somewhat unsatisfying. They'll say, well, China didn't have a market economy. China didn't respect property rights. China didn't respect freedom of expression. Well, neither did Russia. And yet Russia was a near peer Western power right down to the First World War. Now, by that point, they were really starting to falter. And they were beginning to show their age, but that took a long time to manifest. And in fact, in the 19th century, they grappled with Napoleon directly in the Patriotic War and defeated him decisively in the winter of 1812. So why was that decisive in China but not in Russia? I think actually it's because China believed it was, in part of its cultural, part of its the neighbors of the steppe. So if you keep on getting hit by these nomads again and again and again, they burn your cities, they they destroy your crops, they kill your people. Just like Europe in the period from 476 to 1000, you can't really do a whole lot. You're just constantly kept under the gun. But then again, so was Russia. They were occupied by 200 years. So then what made Russia different than China? I think China just was consumed by hubris. They were the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world. Everybody else was barbarians. They had nothing to learn from anyone else. Russia, though it was somewhat Asiatic, was also semi-Western. It was Christian, and it was willing to adopt Western technology and techniques. We see this with their acceptance of gunpowder, and then also later with Peter the Great and his reforms in Russia in the 18th century. So I think what's different is that Western Europe specifically, though, was not exposed to these pressures for about 500 years. China was. During that 500-year period from 1000 to 1500, there was the Yuan dynasty, a Mongol dynasty that ruled China for 150 years. And even after that, there were still threats from nomadic raiders and Japanese pirates. Now, there were many wars in Europe, but unlike the nomads, they weren't going to swoop in and burn down their libraries because other European powers wanted those libraries for themselves to gain information, to get a technical advantage over their enemies. Russia was enough like the Europeans to keep up and to eventually outstrip their Asiatic neighbors. And I think that's ultimately a more satisfying explanation for why China lagged behind the West is the pressure from the steppe. And of all the regions of Eurasia, Western Europe is the first to be completely liberated from that pressure. And so, in my mind, that's a huge driving factor for why they could develop in relative peace and not have to worry about this. And so that's a huge explanation. Also, the fact that you need a certain level of wealth accumulation to build a modern civilization. I don't know what that number is, but below that line, you can't develop an industrial civilization. And the nomads of the steppe ensured that most civilizations never got above that line. Because as soon as it got wealthy enough, they would then incur an invasion by a unified horde led by a great Khan. And so they would then set them back to zero, and then you have to start all over again. And especially if you kill scholars. So like when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, it was like the destruction of the Great Library, but worse. I mean, the Islamic civilization just crumbled after that. Islamic chroniclers said that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers red and black with the ink and blood. The Mongols didn't just massacre people, they also destroyed the texts. And so I bring this up because if the Mongols had kept pushing west and had not been recalled to the death of the Great Khan, what might have happened to Italy had they destroyed the city-states of Italy? Well, there wouldn't have been a Renaissance. And if there hadn't been a Renaissance, that would have set everything else back. So I'm not exactly saying it would have been as devastating as the Islamic disruption of Baghdad, because I think Western civilization had a more distributed scholastic presence. But nonetheless, it would have been hugely disastrous. And at that time, Europe was relatively poor vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Persia. And so when the Mongols did reform the horde to invade, they didn't go back to Europe because it was just not considered worth it. And so given the decisive factor that they can have in setting a civilization back, and that, again, the West was spared from that, I think that's hugely important. And then Russia, because it's more stable, and I didn't really bring this up too much, but the other factor that caused it to outlast the steppe, again, was its faith. Because from the 200 years of the Golden Horde, there's really no unified political structure of Russians. They might be unified by their ethnicity as Slavs, but ultimately what keeps the identity together is the Orthodox Church. And then from there, you then get the formation of the state with Muscovy, which is a mirror of the autocratic system of the Golden Horde. And then they eventually organize and push back. Also, because they're an agricultural bureaucratic society, they have a larger population base. Of all the European countries, even today, Russia has the largest population. So that population can now be put to use to drive the nomads back. And, from like the earliest recorded history of Herodotus, down to the conversion of the Rus to Orthodoxy in 988, nobody lives there. Just scattered nomads of the Indo-Aryans, like the Scythians and the Sarmatians on the western steppe. But further north, it's just like largely uninhabited. So the Russians are able to transform this area, which does have a lot of rivers, and in Ukraine is agriculturally rich, because even the Athenians would import grain from the Pontic steppe, to a power base to then push back the horde. And so with a combination of gunpowder technology, professional army logistics, support from Cossack cavalrymen, as well as, like I said, gunpowder, they could eventually outlast the steppe warriors and push them back. And in so doing, ended that threat more or less permanently, allowing other civilizations to develop as well as their own. And yeah, so they had a long run, 3,000 years, from the invasion of the India by the Indo-Aryans down to the conquest of the Ming by the Manchus. But eventually they were done in by gunpowder and the Russians. And again, it really, everybody knows about Genghis Khan, everybody knows about the Mongols, everybody knows about Attila the Hun. And yet there's this sort of like fantasy that, and largely because I think neoconservatives in the aughts wanted to have a propaganda campaign to get people to fight the war on terror, that Western military forces were dominant, hegemonic prior to gunpowder. That's not true. Gunpowder and technological advantages made the West hegemonic right around the time of Columbus. Before that, you might have had flashes in the pan, like Alexander, who went to India, the Roman state, which controlled the entire Mediterranean basin. But overall, though, prior to Alexander, you had Achaemenids and the great kingdoms of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt. And then after that, you had the Islamic Caliphate, and then you had the steppe nomads penetrating deeply into Europe, beginning with Attila the Hun, down till, threatening Europe down till the Golden Horde. So, and yeah, you just, if you leave that out, of course you can spin whatever tale you want. And then, of course, the left, as I said, has a biased interest in order to not let that happen either. And so I'm like, yeah, I don't buy this. They really need their due. They need their due. They need to be explained for what they are and what impact they had. Somebody says here the Battle of Moche, and not Moche, it's Mohi. Mohi is Mohi. That was a defeat. That was a victory for the Mongols in Hungary. Corbin-based Magyars. Hashim Awan, Nasir Shah also invaded India and looted the Mughal treasury. Yes, he did. Imperator of Forge. The importance of the steppe had a profound influence on Eastern Europe if we are to see the origins of the autocracy that continued to exist after 1917. Then we must surely look at the Tartar legacy. 1230 to 1480. Absolutely. Absolutely. The other thing that's important with that Tartar legacy is prior to the Golden Horde's conquest of Russia, the Kievan Rus were developing parliamentary systems much like the rest of Europe. And even after the conquest of most of the states, Novgorod and Pskov to the far north were spared Mongol conquest and continued to develop along those lines. That was erased under Muscovy after they gained their full independence from the Horde, but actually before. Novgorod was conquered in the 1470s. But given that point, though, Russian culture shifts dramatically in a different direction in order to combat these forces. Record deepness. The bayonet was arguably just as important as the musket in its invention. Well, in the sense that it allowed for the complete abolition of pike blocks, yes. I mean, pike blocks aren't going to be very effective on the steppe. Imperator of Forge, the Timurids also made deep raids in the Golden Horde in Muscovy. The Tartars would fight with each other, and other great Khantu. Yeah, and it's that infighting that ultimately brought down the nomads and allowed Russia as a centralized state to extend further west. Imperator of Forge, Kievan Rus had veches or parliaments, but after the Mongols, all that was left was the church and the boyars and the Tsar. Yep, absolutely. Let's see here. All right, I think that's all we got for today. Now, tomorrow I'll be talking about the Heartland theory. Now, not as a theory. I've already talked about that a couple of years ago with terminal philosophy, but how the Heartland might be a relevant means of analyzing the current Eurasian axis built around Russia and China with Iran and North Korea as allies. So make sure to tune into that tomorrow. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.